Thousands of supporters of U.S. President Donald Trump last night besieged the Capitol in Washington, D.C., where a joint session of Congress was deliberating on the final but one constitutional right towards installing Joe Biden as the country's 46th president. Before the invasion began, it was already a fractious assembly inside the building, as Republican and Democratic lawmakers argued back and forth over the legitimacy or otherwise of electoral college votes that gave Biden victory over Trump after the last presidential election. This singular incident seems to be the culmination of several weeks of tension as Mr. Trump continues his protests against the outcome of that election. As we keep our eyes on developments in Washington, D.C., well, at this point, we'll be joining Laurie Laird, a Rice correspondent and specialist on U.S. politics. Laurie Laird, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Yes, I know you've been following the situation in Washington, D.C., particularly at Capitol Hill. Yesterday morning, I asked you whether you see the possibility of a coup. You were a bit skeptical, but what we are seeing indeed looks like a coup. But should we be rest assured that democracy will prevail at the end of the day and that the anarchy that we have witnessed will not prevail?
Ruben, it feels like a lifetime ago that you and I spoke. I can't believe it was only 24 hours ago. We were talking about the senatorial elections in Georgia. You mentioned the coup, and I dismissed you, and I owe you an apology for that, because certainly many people are describing the unrest. I'm understating things, aren't I? What happened at the Capitol yesterday? There are some people who describe that as a coup. Now, I don't think at any point did people feel that the government was on the risk of being overthrown, but the breaching of the Capitol building by protesters, I don't even know what to call the people that got into the Capitol. Protesters seems a little bit too mild a word. These people were violent. They were fomenting violence, and some legislators called it a coup. It felt short of that. We never felt that the government was at risk of falling. Nonetheless, that was those images were so very unsettling. The iconic Capitol building being stormed by violent protesters. I think that's an image that will stay with us for a very long time.
And Laurie, let's talk about the ongoings on the floor of the Congress at the moment. Pennsylvania seems to be the sticking point. A last attempt to stop what is an inevitable result, isn't it?
This is truly bizarre. We know that Joe Biden will be certified. And in past transitions, this has been a formality, this congressional ratification. It's scarcely got very much airtime because it's a foregone conclusion. It is a foregone conclusion in this event as well. And yet Donald Trump's refusal to accept that he did not win the election and the support that he has got from other Republican lawmakers in this assertion means that this has become a political process, and a political process that turned violent yesterday. Why Pennsylvania has become the center of discontent is a bit of a mystery. It was a tight election in Pennsylvania, but it was not all that tight. I mean, the margin of error was greater. The margin of victory for Joe Biden was greater than 1%, much greater than 1%. So it was not a particularly tight race. I think that Pennsylvania has become a sore point for the Republicans for a couple of reasons. One is it represents 20 electoral votes. That was a bigger prize for Donald Trump than some of the other states that were closely run, like Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin. Also, Pennsylvania, when Donald Trump says that bad things happen in Pennsylvania, he has half a point there. Philadelphia, the biggest city in Pennsylvania in particular, has had, in the 60s and 70s, did have a reputation for political corruption. And I can say that because I grew up in Philadelphia. And certainly Philadelphia was known for some dodgy dealings over the years. So I think that's one reason that Pennsylvania has been in the spotlight. But it's fascinating that the lawmakers that have raised objections to Pennsylvania, and I'm thinking Josh Hawley from Missouri, who in the Senate was one of the senators who objected to certifying the Pennsylvania result. He has nothing to do with Pennsylvania. Just for the Republicans, this seems to be what they view as a chink in the Democratic armor.
Right. I mean, what would you say about the role of people like Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri and Ted Cruz yesterday that fanned the embers of all of this with President Trump? And what would you say? Would you say the protesters going into the Capitol is a direct reaction to the rally yesterday in Washington, D.C., where it was said, and in fact, it was shown on Fox this morning, that the president's lawyer did say mob the House with violence, protest with commotion?
Well, I think a number of interesting points that you made there, Ruben. Certainly the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, has done nothing to calm the waters at all. And Donald Trump hasn't either. Certainly when Donald Trump addressed crowds yesterday, he said to them, go up to the Capitol. He seemed to give their blessing. And Donald Trump, furthermore, in that video that he released on Twitter, told his supporters that he loved them. He did tell them to go home, but he told them he loved them as well. So certainly that's not discouraging people from taking to violence in his name. Josh, you mentioned Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, two senators who have objected to the certification of certain results. What they're playing at, well, that's entirely unclear. As I said when we started, there's no question that these results will be certified. So what political mileage do these two men get? These are two names that both believe have presidential ambitions. And in fact, Ted Cruz has run for president and lost to Donald Trump in the primaries in 2015, 2016. In fact, it's interesting because Ted Cruz and Donald Trump had a dreadful relationship. They were bitter adversaries during the 2016 election and in the primary that preceded that in 2015. So it's odd to see Ted Cruz sort of in a roundabout way going to bat for Donald Trump. Josh Hawley is a bit younger, but certainly has made no secret of his ambitions within the Republican Party. Does that mean that both men are doing this for political gain? We certainly can't rule it out. However, I think it's worth pointing out that after those ugly incidents on Capitol Hill yesterday, that it was the Republican majority Senate that seemed to be more chastened, more rattled by those events. After Josh Hawley registered his objections in the joint session of Congress, that meant that both houses adjourned for in theory, debate on that objection. The Senate immediately dismissed those 2 hours and went straight to a roll call vote. Objections to the certification of Pennsylvania results were rejected in the Senate, and then that Senate session ended. While the House of Representatives debated it, and a number of Republican representatives stood up, voiced their objection to certifying the Pennsylvania votes, and then essentially sounded like acolytes of Donald Trump, referring to electoral irregularities, relitigating this election result in Pennsylvania, despite the fact that multiple courts in Pennsylvania have upheld the results. But it was the senators who seemed more chastened by this, more rattled, took a softer tone than the House of Representatives, which is held by the Democrats.
Well, Laurie, I mean, President Donald Trump is not the first American president who will lose election and will be suffering from a withdrawal syndrome. As far back as the election of 1800, we had John Adams. 1828, we had John Quincy Adams, his son, refusing to leave. 9 years later, we had Andrew Jackson. Somewhere down the line, we had Andrew Johnson. But America has never seen anything like this. What does the drama that unfolded yesterday in Washington, D.C., what does it say about Donald Trump's legacy? Because this looks like a disgraceful end to his presidency.
We talk about historical things with Donald Trump's presidency, and it seems like almost every day we use that word historical, but this is historical. In no time in our memory can we think of a time that armed protesters stormed the Capitol building. Absolutely extraordinary scenes. As for Donald Trump's legacy, I think we can honestly say, Ruben, that we can't write it yet. When we woke up yesterday morning, it felt like there are 2 weeks left to Donald Trump's presidency. That's not that long. We're nearly to the end of it. And whether you support Donald Trump or not, that 2 weeks felt like the end of his presidency. Now, after those events on Capitol Hill yesterday, 2 weeks feels like an incredibly long time. It feels like there is a lot left to happen with this presidency. Will he see the end of it? There's talk of moves to try and remove him from office, and I'm sure we'll discuss that later. There has been this violence on his watch. Donald Trump is certainly, if not explicitly, certainly tacitly, seems to have condoned this violence. Could there be more violence in the days leading up to the inauguration of Joe Biden? This presidency has more time to run. And of course, a couple of days ago, how long ago that seems, we were actually discussing the possibility, could Donald Trump do something abroad? Iran has been provocative. Could Iran somehow provoke Donald Trump into doing something in the Middle East, doing something off of America's shores? Donald Trump's legacy, I think, is yet to be decided.
Indeed, it seems we have a president who is at war with his own administration, throwing Vice President Mike Pence under the bus yesterday. A president who is at war with his own country, his own party. So I guess the larger question here, Laurie, is would there be repercussions? And you're right, 2 weeks seems like a long time to go.
I think the question about, well, let's look at Donald Trump at war with his cabinet, because I think that is fairly accurate. Over the past 4 years, Donald Trump has slowly replaced anyone who challenges him with more malleable figures. We're hearing a lot of speculation about resignations and bracing ourselves for resignations. The latest rumor is that Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, could soon hand in his resignation. CNN has reported within the past 20 minutes or so that the Deputy National Security Advisor has in fact resigned. Could be more resignations to come. Difficult to tell with that. But Donald Trump at war with his party, this is a really interesting question. Certainly a number of Republicans, and you mentioned Mike Pence, but also Mitch McConnell, for the moment, the Senate Majority Leader, although after the results in Georgia, he will not hold that role for very much longer. But Mitch McConnell has, to a certain extent, done the president's bidding over the past 4 years. Yesterday, he stood up in the Senate. He introduced this certification process and talked about unity, talked about the end of the Trump era, talked about certifying Biden as the next president. He sounded much more like a bipartisan than I have heard Mitch McConnell sound in years. And this was before the violence on Capitol Hill. Mike Pence, so often the man who came out to do Donald Trump's bidding, to distribute the Trump message just in a less abrasive fashion, also is talking about unity. There's been a lot of reporting that Mike Pence is extremely upset about Donald Trump's criticism of him and events on Capitol Hill yesterday, and certainly in the Senate, presiding over the certification proceedings. Mike Pence stayed away from any kind of partisan rancor and stuck to the job at hand, the procedural job at hand of certifying the electoral results. So there is a bit of, amongst the party leadership, there does seem to be a bit of distancing between the party leadership and Donald Trump. But that's not consistent in the party. There are certainly more junior Republicans that are happy to take the Trump line. How long that will last is an open question. Both of the Republican candidates for senatorial seats in Georgia aligned themselves with Donald Trump during their campaign. They both lost their seats yesterday, but we are still seeing the likes of Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz align themselves with Donald Trump. So the state of the Republican Party at this point is a little bit unclear.
I mean, I want to talk about the character of the Republican Party. And you said some senators are aligning themselves, but some have started thinking otherwise. It was a very moving speech this morning by Kelly Loefflin, that was once in support of this process that, there should be, disruptions as regards recertification of the election. But after the violence, she peddled that. But I want to talk about the character of the GOP, the grand old party. In 2000, something of this happened. Al Gore was the vice president, had a disputed election with President Bush, and that went down to the wires. And the court ordered a recount. And at that recount, the Republican Party used a certain man called Roger Stone to disrupt the recount and make the recount favor the Republican Party. Al Gore was to do the same thing Mike Pence did today, and he went ahead, despite the hurt and the pain, he certified the election. This is happening again, a dispute by the Republican Party. What does that say about the character of the grand old party?
Well, it's interesting to bring up 2000. I think that's the closest parallel we have, and yet there are vast differences. The 2000 election actually was disputed. The difference in the counting in Florida was a couple of, and let me backtrack a little bit. The election in 2000, Florida was called initially for Al Gore, then for George Bush. Then it was deemed a toss-up. There were numerous recounts. There was a lot of controversy over. In those days, the ballot machines. You took a card and put it in a ballot machine, pulled a lever. The lever would push out bits of paper next to your candidate's name. Some of those bits of paper did not fully come out of their preparation, so there were bits of paper hanging on, making it difficult to interpret those ballots. So the judiciary was brought in to litigate that, how to read these ballots. And the election in Florida was tight, down to, I believe it was 235 votes in the end. It was, regardless of where you are on the partisan divide, it was a disputed election. Both sides were disputing. There was not a clear winner in the state of Florida, which ended up determining the national election. In the 2020 election, forgive me, the only people who are disputing the election are Donald Trump and his allies. There have been no states where the vote was as close as Florida. No states where there were, a couple of hundred votes between the two candidates. Yes, there were some close states. In the state of Georgia, the margin between Joe Biden and Donald Trump was 11,000 votes. 11,000 votes is paltry. It's very little, but it's a lot more than 235 votes. And in the end, Georgia is not all that electorally important. It doesn't contribute that much to the Electoral College total. So this result is not disputed unless you're a Republican ally of Donald Trump. And this is something that's absolutely fascinating, because the likes of Ted Cruz have said that before they will certify the results, they want an inquiry from Congress into voting irregularities. The reason they say they want that is because they say the American people have lost the trust of the election. They don't believe this election. But this is a circular argument, because one of the reasons people doubt the result of the election is because a cabal of Republicans have told them the results are not correct. No court in the land has confirmed this.
Well, Laurie, two quick questions. I want to go back first to the issue Adesu had raised about repercussions. Clearly, what happened in Washington, D.C. yesterday was gross misconduct on the part of President Trump, mobilizing a mob to take over the very seat of democracy in the United States. And she was asking you about repercussions. Now, the U.S. National Association of Manufacturers has asked that Vice President Mike Pence should invoke the 25th Amendment. In other words, under the 25th Amendment, it is still possible between now and January 20 to remove President Trump from office. Do you see that possibility? Rep. Omar Ilhan has also asked that impeachment proceedings should be commenced immediately against President Trump. Do you see the possibility of that working out? And then the second question has to do with the fact that there were copycat protests yesterday in Los Angeles. Do you see the possibility of an escalation by the time Congress concludes its certification assignment?
I mean, that's a couple of questions in there, and they're all very, very good ones. Let's take impeachment first, because that is the shortest one. And Ilhan Omar, the member of the House of Representatives from Minnesota, and someone that Donald Trump has been very derogatory about. She was a Somali refugee, came to the U.S. from Kenya when she was 12 years old. She has said that she will start impeachment proceedings immediately. She is a Democrat. I think impeachment, as we saw with Donald Trump with impeachment, there's the impeachment, which is a conviction essentially in the House of Representatives and a removal from office. Democrats failed to remove him from office with the last impeachment early in 2019. I think impeachment is unlikely, but I do suspect that there will be some Democratic representatives who at least file impeachment charges symbolically. 25th Amendment, let's spend some time on that. I think this will be the phrase of the next 24 hours. This will be the buzz term that everybody is discussing. The 25th Amendment is the part of the Constitution that allows the government, the cabinet, or ultimately Congress to remove a president from office. To clear the bar for the 25th Amendment is pretty high. The measure would have to be initiated by the vice president, who is Mike Pence. And Mike Pence's thoughts right now are a very interesting question. He has been such a supporter of Donald Trump. Where does he stand now? We're all looking for more information on that. But for the 25th Amendment to be invoked, the vice president would need to secure the support of half of the cabinet to say that the president is unfit to perform his duties. If that were to happen, then the president would be given the choice to go or not to go. If the president were to decline and be unwilling to go, then the 25th Amendment provides for a vote in both houses of Congress. A 2/3 majority in each chamber would be needed to remove the president from office if he is unwilling to go. So there are 3 bars to clear there. It is very hard to do that. The framers of the Constitution made it pretty difficult to remove a president from office, made it clear that this couldn't be done on a whim. Nonetheless, talk of the 25th Amendment has been gathering steam over the past couple of hours. A Democratic representative from Pennsylvania, Madeline Dean, was talking just within the past hour about how she would like to see the 25th Amendment invoked. I suspect we'll see a lot of talk about this, but the bar to clear to remove the president from office is so very high. That's not to say that we couldn't see some twists and turns and surprises over the next couple of days. You know, as we said in our opening comments, 2 weeks is a long time when it comes to the presidency of Donald Trump.
I asked you about any likelihood of escalation in other capital cities in the United States, as we witnessed yesterday in Los Angeles.
That's an excellent question, and I think this is, if we're talking about what happens after the events of yesterday, this is one thing to really keep an eye on. And if I could backpedal for a moment, many of us watching those troubling images, disturbing images on the Capitol yesterday, were struck by the lack of police presence. You know, I've been to the Capitol many times. As an average citizen, you cannot mount the Capitol steps where so many protesters were gathered as a private citizen, much less a protester. How did all of those protesters get to the top of the Capitol steps, much less close enough to scale the walls, to break windows and gain access to the Capitol building? The lack of police presence, to me, was very striking. And many Democrats have pointed out images that we will all remember of Black Lives Matters protests all over the country, but particularly in Washington, D.C., where largely peaceful protesters were being met by cordons of police officers, in some cases armed. We saw none of those sorts of images for the first hour, 2 hours of the siege of the Capitol. I found that incredibly striking. And ex-chief of police from Washington, D.C., Charles Ramsey, and then the commissioner of police in Philadelphia, two tough policing cities, expressed his surprise. Where were the police? How did they allow things to get so out of control? Questions have to be answered there. Police have been reinforced in Washington, D.C., and we're seeing a lot of images now of police patrolling the streets. They have managed to disperse all of the protesters. So while there's been some talk of protesters calling for an occupation of Washington, D.C., my guess is the heavy police presence in the city at this moment may make Washington a more difficult place to express dissent. Muriel Bowser, the Democratic mayor of the city, has also extended an emergency order for 2 weeks, so going beyond the inauguration. But getting back to your point, could we see this unrest spread to other cities? I suspect that is more likely than not. You mentioned these copycat protests. I would be very surprised if those protests did not grow in other cities that haven't been reinforced to the extent that Washington has.
Well, Laurie Laird, please stay with us. Looks like the joint session has reconvened on Capitol Hill. So we'll go to Washington, D.C. To try and follow the proceedings. Nancy Pelosi on the screen there.
Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device and are reminded to vote when their group is called and to leave the chamber after they have voted.
Well, Democrats and Republicans voting there on the objection. I guess this is the objection on Pennsylvania, which was the last objection. The first was the objection to the result from Arizona. And the session went into recession for about 2 hours, and they came back, and the Republicans who objected did not have the numbers. And of course, it was the same with Georgia, it was the same with Michigan, it was the same with Nevada. Of course, we didn't expect that it would be different with Pennsylvania. And from what we're seeing on the screen, the people objecting to the objection seem to be in the majority. I think, as Laurie Laird was saying, it looks like the certification of the results in favor of President-elect Joe Biden will succeed. And at the end of the day, the only residue we'll be left with will be President Trump's, tantrums, his misconduct, his unpresidential behavior, and the manner in which he has, humiliated his own person. Long before now, the American Psychiatric Association, on 2 different occasions, reported that the President of the United States would need to be subjected to psychiatric examination because some psychiatrists said that they were not sure that he was in a fit and proper, frame of mind to be able to provide necessary leadership. But, that was controversial at the time. Nothing came out of it. But I've seen quite a number of commentaries indicating that perhaps we're dealing with a psychological crisis.
Oh, yeah, you're correct.
In fact, somebody was even suggesting that President Trump is so desperate, family members may need to keep an eye on him so that he doesn't harm himself physically as a result of the frustration of losing the election.
You're correct. I mean, it's sad how America has gotten now, I saw anarchy staring at the face of the Capitol yesterday. And it was a good point you raised, psychological examination. I remember there was a specific candidate back in the days, I think in the 60s or 70s elections in America, that his presidential bid was taunted, came to an end because it was said that he had gotten electric treatment, for a psychological problem at a point. And you now narrowed out that to today, where you see Trump showing these signs. His niece, Mary, that wrote a book about him, talking about the grandeur of illusion and all sorts, Trump has battling with. It's very sad at a point like this. It's very sad that the President of America, was there at the rally that instigated all of this. He caused this. He incited violence. You needed to hear the rhetoric. I was watching the rally yesterday. The president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York, came out to say, have a mob action, protest on the Capitol with your violence. Those were his words. Rudy Giuliani said that. Trump also said they should go to the Capitol. I'm sure Trump knows the sacredness of the Capitol when he sent his people to go there. And the sad part for me is that this has led to the loss of lives. There was a woman that was shot. I think she was a law enforcement officer in the chest. That woman passed on. I hear they've recorded 3 to 4 deaths. They have seen IEDs in the Capitol. That's improvised explosive devices in the Capitol. I mean, what I saw yesterday just reminded me of a movie. It was like a movie scene. I'm sure you've seen Designated Survival. It was only in Designated Survival I saw something like this. I never knew it could happen real life. And it happened real life yesterday. And, there are many, many people talking about this. The effect of Trump. I mean, we're talking about the 25th Amendment, Dr. Baz. You raised a vital point. But I also want to argue, hasn't the 25th Amendment been pushed forward already? Because from findings yesterday, it was obvious it was the vice president that called the National Guard where there was a sitting president. It was the vice president that called the National Guard where there was a sitting president. We all know the implication of that. And you say the cabinet supported. Laurie Laird was saying half of the cabinet must support it. Half of almost a certain portion of the cabinet has resigned already in protest of what has happened.
In as much as we would like to see.
3 persons have resigned so far. The Deputy National Security Advisor, the Chief of Staff to the First Lady, and also the White House Social Secretary. 3 of them have resigned so far. But there may be more resignations.
In as much as we'd like to say and see that President Donald Trump seems to be a lonely man at the moment, that's not the true reflection of things from even what we're seeing on the floor at the moment. It's a split screen. You recall that while the senators, had backtracked from following through with their objection after the violence we saw yesterday, the Republicans in the House decided to go ahead with their objection to it, and that's why we've had this process prolonged up to now. The senators cut this debate and the objection from 2 hours, but it's not the case here in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, where they seem to be rehashing the plans to ensure that this is not a smooth process. This should have been a ceremonial procedure to just certify the voting of American people to elect their next president.
Well, now that they have gone as far as Pennsylvania, we expect that by the end of today, the certification would be complete. Now, one other dimension of it is that the international community has also been responding. Quite a number of heads of states in Europe have condemned what happened yesterday in the United States, including Boris Johnson, who is ordinarily a friend of President Trump, who described what happened in Washington, D.C. as a disgraceful situation in the United States. But I'm still waiting. I hope that the Nigerian government will also make a statement. Because we're a very close ally of the United States. We share the U.S.-Nigeria Bilateral Commission together. One of the major items of concern to that commission is democracy. And I think Nigeria, as the most populous, as a leading country in Africa, should show interest in what is going on in the United States. I think, our president should also issue a statement of concern
Yes.
about what is happening. And our mission in Washington, D.C. should issue an advisory to Nigerians living in the Washington, D.C. area. That's where you have perhaps the largest concentration of Nigerians. I think it will be well within the policy of citizen diplomacy for Nigeria to issue a statement to our citizens around the Washington area to tell them to stay away from capital area.
Yes.
Because this has been described as a terrorist attack, and we have a responsibility to protect our people.
And it has to be said, very well said, Dr.
I hope that will come before the end of today.
Hopefully.
Because America no longer has the monopoly of democratic standards. You have seen how one man has destroyed that privileged position that the U.S. used to enjoy. Laurie Laird is back with us. Laurie, are you with us?
I mean, Laurie?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought me back in. I'm listening with interest to your to the conversation about Donald Trump's mental health, and I don't think there's anyone on the planet who would consider him to be acting sanely at the moment. But I think it's worth pointing out that we have dysfunction in the executive in the U.S. in the form of Donald Trump, but when we talk so much about Donald Trump, and my gosh, it's hard not to. I mean, the man has done some astounding things while in office and over the past couple of days. But his exaggerated actions, I think, sometimes overshadow the dysfunctionality of Congress as well. Republicans in Congress have enabled this sort of behavior from Donald Trump. In fact, we still have the likes of Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Senate leaders saying that this election may not have been free and fair, despite the fact that no court in the land says this. We also have to remember that despite Donald Trump's faults, and the list is long, this is a man who was elected. He won an election in 2016. No, he didn't win the popular vote, but the way the law is written in the U.S., it's the Electoral College that determines the president, and he won that. And remember, that election in November of 2016 came shortly after Donald Trump made some extremely derogatory comments about assaulting women. And yet, Americans voted for him. A fairly large minority of Americans voted for him again in 2020. Not a majority, not enough to win in the election, but Joe Biden won decisively. It wasn't a landslide. Many people, for whatever reason, continue to support an erratic Donald Trump, and I find that astounding. And when Donald Trump was hauled up on impeachment charges, the Senate, which was stacked with Republicans, chose not to remove him from office. So until very recently, Congress has enabled Donald Trump. There haven't been sufficient checks on his power. Congress has not been operating as an equal branch of government with the executive. And the way the U.S. is set up, the judiciary, the executive, which is Donald Trump leads, and the legislature are all meant to be equal. They are all meant to exert checks on each other. I would say that Congress has resolutely failed to do this.
Right.
And Laurie, we've seen some unprecedented response to the horrifying events that unfolded yesterday night. Talking about social media, for the first time, we have seen the accounts of the President of the United States suspended.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's almost difficult to get that statement out of your mouth. The President of the United States has been suspended from using Twitter. You expect to hear that from about criminals or sex pests or people who dabble in illicit activities. The President of the United States has been blocked from Twitter and facing a potential ban. It is absolutely extraordinary. But you bring up an interesting point about how social media has affected political discourse in the U.S. Certainly, social media media, I think, has had a big role in the polarization of the parties. Back in the days, you guys are young enough to not even remember broadsheet newspapers, perhaps, but when you read a broadsheet newspaper, you're forced to consume information that perhaps may not have interested you when the news is put in front of you, open up, in big sheets of paper. When people consume their news online, they tend to only click on things that interest them. They tend to click on things that reinforce their existing beliefs. So I think that really has closed the breadth of political discourse, and it's prevented people from having to engage with an opposing point of view.
All right, Laurie, I want to go back historical and cite historical antecedents now. When Ted Cruz was making his deposition in the House, he cited yet another very contentious election. That was the election of 1876. When you go back historically and look at that election, that was the election that brought Rutherford Hayes into power, a man that did a lot of reforms for America. The elections went down to the wire. There were disagreements across both camps, and that election was decided by having independent team with a jury, with lawmakers, bipartisan lawmakers to be able to make an agreement. That was what Ted Cruz was suggesting we do yesterday in this situation. But that bipartisan team could not reach a quorum on the decision of the election. What later happened in the 1876 election of Rutherford Hayes was the fact that the Republicans and the Democrats had to meet in a certain hotel and make an agreement. And Rutherford Hayes was made the president. And throughout his tenure, in fact, his name, Rutherford, was changed to Rutherford Hayes. That was the legacy that tainted his administration because of things like this. I mean, when you plot that historical antecedents, what will be the same in this case?
Well, I think that, when you talk about this bipartisan commission, it's an interesting parallel, but I think the very, very big difference here is that when Ted Cruz, you mentioned Ted Cruz, when Ted Cruz is grandstanding and calling for an inquiry into electoral irregularities, Ted Cruz is a really smart guy. Ted Cruz has a law degree from Harvard. It's one of the top law schools in the country. Ted Cruz fully knows that nothing he can do right now can influence the outcome of the election. He knows that it's a done deal. And what I believe, and what many people believe, is motivating Ted Cruz is his own presidential ambitions, and he can play these out in front of a television camera, which the electors who have ultimately decided on the election of Rutherford Hayes didn't have the opportunity to do. They didn't have a television in front of them. They didn't have an immediate connection with the electorate. And so behind closed doors, they had to sit down and get the job done. Now, with television screens, this is a way for aspirational politicians to further their careers. Ted Cruz, more than anybody, knows there's not a hope of overturning the outcome of this election. But for whatever reason that may benefit him down the road, he has decided that perpetuating this myth that Donald Trump may not have won the election, this suits him, and he'll do it in front of the cameras.
Well, Laurie Laird, we have on the screen the voting in the House of Representatives on the objection to the results from the state of Pennsylvania. And from what we can see on the screen there, it looks like there is a majority vote in the House of Representatives against that objection, 229, with 55 Republicans even objecting to that objection. The Democrats voting en bloc. Do you expect that this is the pattern we will also see from the Senate, which is also voting on that objection at this moment? What's your reading of it?
Well, I mean, the Senate decided not to engage with any kind of debate on this. And I have to say, I'm a little bit surprised that the House did engage in debate. I'm surprised that after the events of yesterday at the Capitol, that the House didn't just dispense with all of this, do a straight up and down vote, and get back to the main event, which is certifying the whole country results. I'm surprised that Nancy Pelosi the Speaker of the House wasn't able to close down the Republicans, wasn't able to get some kind of bipartisan unity after the trauma that every one of those legislators went through yesterday, to close this down and just bring this process, which is a formality. Let's look at it. This is a formality. I'm surprised she didn't manage to bring this to an end. And let's not forget, I wish I had on the top of my head the average age of a legislator in the U.S. But some of these legislators, including Nancy Pelosi, are older than average. Nancy Pelosi is 80. At the very least, these people must be getting tired. And listening to Pelosi, she sounds exhausted. I think that I'm surprised that there isn't more of an effort to bring this to an end, to shut down bipartisan rancor, which comes with these debates, and to also get these people some sleep.
Well, the objection already failed in the Senate. The vote was 92-7, and as expected, part of the 7 senators, we saw Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Hawley on that list. But Laurie, let's talk about the international reaction to this situation in America so far. Any surprises, and what does this mean for the allies of America? And on the other hand, those who are seen as enemies, those who have had contentious relationship with the President Donald Trump administration so far, could they take advantage of this?
I'm a little bit more, I mean, the international reaction, I have to say, has surprised me a little bit. It's unusual to see so much condemnation of events in a country when the president is still sitting there. So very surprised at the very harsh tone taken by America's closest allies, like Boris Johnson here in the UK, like Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. These are the closest allies America has or had. Donald Trump has not worked particularly hard to nurture his relationship with America's traditional allies. But one of the things that I found so very astounding was a message to Turkish citizens living in the U.S. from their own government, telling Turks living in Washington, D.C. to avoid the city center for their own safety. This is the sort of message that we usually have the State Department in the U.S. warning citizens in the U.S. who may be living or passing through, say, a Middle Eastern city that might be undergoing unrest. To hear Turkey warning its citizens to watch their safety in the capital of the United States is an astounding turn of events.
All right. Yeah, it's just the sign of changing times. And we would like to warn our own fellow Nigerian citizens in the UK, in America, I should say, because a lot of Nigerians, Laurie, live around Virginia and Maryland, which is close to the Washington. So they should be safe in that area, too. But, Laurie, I want to start digging into what happened yesterday. A lot of people all over the world smell a level of complicity. At first, no adequate security at the Capitol when there was a very big protest in Washington, D.C. yesterday. The security was quickly breached, properties damaged. It was so quick for them to get into the Capitol. Yesterday, you could see that assault on the center of American democracy. A protester sat on the seats normally the vice president would sit on and took a picture with a sign in his hands. All of that happened. And also, Laurie, I want you to talk me through the contention about calling the National Guard. Because some arguments that raged on yesterday was the fact that D.C. should be given a state status. It was so difficult to get a National Guard. They had to get in the National Guard from the governor of Virginia and Maryland yesterday. The rancor, before they could get the National Guard in, put a curfew in to bring down what happened. That's the center of democracy. That's the home of Lincoln.
I share your astonishment at the way that the Capitol was policed yesterday. And I am not a policing expert. Perhaps there were things going on behind the scenes that I missed. There's been some speculation that Capitol Police, there are two police forces that operate in Washington, D.C. One is the Capitol Police, and they report to Congress. The other is the D.C. Metropolitan Police, and they account to the mayor, Muriel Bowser, who is a Democrat, but has been has developed a national profile, not least because of the Black Lives Matter protests that went through Washington over the summer. So two different police forces. Perhaps there were miscommunication between them. Perhaps there were problems with their working together, although historically this has not been a problem. But I think there are questions to be answered, and to be answered very, very quickly, as to why the police did not seem to be present, why these were these massive breaches of security at the nation's capital. As you say, there have been some reports that the Capitol Police prioritized the safety of the large number of legislators that were in the building. They were whisked away. They were escorted to a secure, undisclosed location. Congressional reporters were in that party as well. It may be that they prioritize the safety of the legislators. We haven't heard enough about that, but I think that we need to hear more about that. And the residents of Washington, D.C. need to hear more about that. The images that we have seen the National Guard come in, the D.C. National Guard, also the National Guard from the neighboring states of Maryland and Virginia. I believe there was a statement not long ago from Andrew Cuomo, the Democratic governor of New York. He said he will be sending New York's National Guard down to Washington. The National Guard is a semi-civilian military operation. Each state operates, has its own National Guard force, but they are able to travel in the case of emergency. There are also federal agents. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms could be pulled in. The FBI could be pulled in. So there are lots of forces that can be called upon in D.C. Why they were not effective yesterday is an open question, and I think it's a question that really needs to be answered very quickly.
Well, Laurie, we're just a few minutes to the top of the hour, but I would like you, before we move on, to comment on Georgia, the runoff. As at the time we spoke yesterday, it was Raphael Warnock who had been announced, but at the end of the day, John Ossoff also won. So we now have the Democrats 50 seats, the Republicans 50 seats, the Democrats having +1, the tiebreaker, head by Kamala Harris. What is the significance of this for the incoming administration? And, with regard to filibustering and legislation?
I can't believe that conversation we had was only 24 hours ago. It seems a quainter, simpler era when we were talking about those Georgia Senate races. I think one thing that was interesting then, and it's worth discussing now, is that the two defeated Republican candidates for those Senate races, that Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, very closely aligned themselves with Donald Trump. Donald Trump went and campaigned for them. Back on the 4th of November, when Donald Trump did better in the election than we thought, we were talking about Trumpism. Is it still alive? Do people like the Trumpism as a kind of a body of thought? They just don't like the message. Kelly, the defeat of Loeffler and Perdue yesterday seemed to poke a hole in that theory. Perhaps Trumpism is not alive and well. I think the future of the Republican Party still needs to be written, but events of yesterday, I think, will go even further toward loosening that stranglehold that Donald Trump had over the Republican Party for 4 years.
Laird, for joining us this morning on the morning show. Thank you very much indeed. Well,
spells it all.
Yeah, well.
It spells it all. And it was a very good point you raised, Dr. Abate, about Nigerian issuing that statement. I'm excited that Laurie just confirmed it with saying that Turkey has issued that statement, because it has gotten to a point in the world today that we need to defend democracy. And anyway, we see democracy is under threat. We need to defend democracy. And even if those we look up to for democracy, this is the same country where Lincoln said at the Gettysburg Address that this is the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. This is the home of democracy. These are the people we quote. The world wants to quote the American Constitution. We want to say, we the people. We want to talk about, pursuit of happiness, freeborn, right to liberty and life. But this is not liberty we saw on TV yesterday.
The United States has always been projected as a bastion of democracy.
Of democracy.
And the US, one government after the other, had always held other people, other countries accountable to certain standards of democratic conduct that they define. And it's good that Laurie brought up the example of Turkey. Can you imagine Turkey?
I can tell you.
But I think Nigeria, we have a responsibility because we have a major stake, particularly in that eastern part of the United States. I mean, I lived in the Washington area for about a year, and I know there is very big Nigerian community from Washington, D.C. to Maryland, to all the way to Pennsylvania, the whole of that axis. You would think that you are in Nigeria in some communities, even in Baltimore.
In Baltimore,
the population of Nigerians that you find there. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs should just issue a statement.
Yes.
Yes, and ask our people to keep safe.
Indeed.
Because Nigerians, we have this busybody tendency. Don't go and collect a bullet with your chest.
I know.
In the name of going to, look at what is going
and
on
also,
in
there are some
capital.
Nigerians that might be targets.
One country having a field day right now is China.
Oh, yes.
China is having a field
Putin,
day.
Russia.
They have described this. They are comparing this to the anti-government protests in Hong Kong, and they recall Speaker Pelosi's statement to the protests in Hong Kong and say this is exactly the same thing.
Russia is also laughing.
Yeah.
They are comparing what is happening to what happened in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Iran is also having fun. At the
All these
expense of
nations are having fun at the
It's
end of
such a shame.
America.